Bread really does mold faster now, and your memory isn't wrong. Whole loaves cooled and kept in a cupboard held up for days longer than the soft sliced bread most of us buy today. Something changed in how bread gets made, and it happened quietly enough that nobody put it on the label. By the end of this, you'll know the 3 real reasons behind that shift. Once you see them, you can get some of that old shelf life back on purpose. You're not comparing 2 different foods here. You're comparing the same food, made 2 different ways, and only one of those ways still shows up in most kitchens today. Nobody ran a controlled experiment stacking bread from 100 years ago against a loaf from this morning, because nobody was measuring mold rates back then. But you don't need that kind of study to trust what you're remembering, because the same science that explains mold now also explains what used to keep it away. Picture the 2 loaves side by side. The old one is whole, dense, cooled all the way through before anyone wrapped it up, and stored somewhere cool and dry, maybe a bread tin or a cupboard shelf. The new one is soft, already sliced, sealed in plastic while it's still faintly warm, and sitting out in a kitchen that's warmer and more humid than most people realize. Those 2 loaves were never going to age the same way. Here's what actually changed between them: how long the dough sat and fermented before baking, what got added to the recipe or left out of it, and what happens to the loaf once it comes out of the oven. Each one on its own would slow mold down a little. Together, they used to slow it down a lot. Start with fermentation because it's the biggest piece of this. Old-fashioned bread relied on a slow process where wild yeast and bacteria worked on the dough for hours, sometimes overnight, before anyone put it near an oven. That's what a sourdough starter still does today, and it isn't a trendy word for old bread. It's bread made the way most bread used to be made, before speed became the priority. While those bacteria work, they produce acid, mostly lactic acid and acetic acid, the same family of acid you'd find in yogurt or a jar of pickles. A healthy starter usually lands somewhere between pH 3.5 and 4.3. And a loaf made with a good amount of that starter settles around pH 4.7 to 5.4. That's noticeably more acidic than a same-day loaf made with fast-acting commercial yeast. That yeast tends to stay close to neutral. Sourdough wasn't the only method old bakers used to by that time. Many traditional loaves relied on a preferment instead, a portion of dough mixed hours ahead and left to develop before joining the rest of the batch. A ready preferment looks bubbly on top and smells faintly tangy, and that tang is the same acid building up early. Full sourdough culture, or simple preferment, the pattern stayed the same. Give the dough time, and it starts protecting itself. That acid matters because mold doesn't do well in it. Most common bread molds slow down hard once the environment turns acidic enough, since the acid gets inside the mold cells and disrupts how they function. Researchers testing this directly found that bread made with an antifungal strain of lactic acid bacteria stayed mold-free for 12 days at room temperature, while a matching loaf without that fermentation went moldy in 4. So the tang in an old-fashioned loaf did more than add flavor. It kept that bread edible for days after a modern loaf, made without any of that same fermentation time, would already be sitting there spotted with mold. Slow fermentation is exactly what industrial bread production moved away from. Once bread turned into a mass-produced product, the priority shifted to speed, getting a loaf from mixer to shelf as fast as possible, using strong commercial yeast instead of a slow wild culture. Less time fermenting means less acid builds up, and less acid means less natural protection against mold. Bakeries knew that, so a lot of them made up the difference with chemical preservatives, mainly calcium propionate. That ingredient genuinely works. One study found that a small amount, around 0.25%, stopped several common bread molds cold at room temperature. For decades, that trade held up fine, with less fermentation offset by more preservative, and a similar shelf life either way, no matter which bakery you bought from. That raises an obvious question about why bread still seems to mold so fast today, if preservatives can handle the job. The answer comes down to a lot of bakeries pulling those preservatives back out. Shoppers started reading ingredient lists and pushing back on anything that looked chemical or hard to pronounce. So plenty of bakeries went clean label, dropping calcium propionate and similar additives to keep the list short and familiar. What most of them didn't bring back was the slow fermentation that used to do that same job on its own. The difference shows up right on the shelf. Packaged bread with preservatives still in it typically holds up for 5 to 7 days at room temperature. Bread without preservatives, and without much fermentation either, can mold in as little as 2 to 4 days in a warm kitchen. Reading "no preservatives" on a bag feels like a win, but it usually just means something else has to be doing that job. And most of the time, nothing is. Fermentation and preservatives explain what's happening inside the dough, but they don't explain everything. The third cause is different because it has nothing to do with the recipe at all, and everything to do with the loaf's life after it leaves the oven and lands on your counter. Mold doesn't just need moisture. It needs moisture it can actually use, which food scientists call water activity. Above roughly 0.91 on that scale, mold and most other microbes grow easily, and soft modern sandwich bread usually sits above 0.95, comfortably inside that range. That means it's vulnerable by default unless something else is working against it. Bagging a loaf in plastic while it's still a little warm traps moisture right at the surface, building something close to a small greenhouse for the mold spores already floating around in any kitchen's air. Compare that to the older habit, a whole unsliced loaf, cooled completely before it went anywhere near storage, kept in a dryer tin or cupboard with far less surface exposed at any one time. Every slice you cut opens another spot for spores to land. A full loaf simply gives them fewer chances to do it. The molds doing this work have names you'd probably recognize under a microscope, mainly Rhizopus, Aspergillus, and Penicillium. They're not exotic, just opportunistic floaters waiting for a spot to land. Refrigeration slows them down without stopping them completely, and it comes with its own cost, since cold air dries out and toughens bread faster than leaving it on the counter ever would. Freezing is the one method that stops them outright, even though the spores themselves survive being frozen. Put plainly, even a well-made loaf with no fermentation advantage and no preservative in it will mold fast if it gets bagged warm and left somewhere humid. That's not bad luck, it's water activity, doing exactly what it always does. None of these three causes work alone, and that's really the whole answer. Fermentation, preservatives, and storage used to layer on top of each other. An old loaf carried acid from slow fermentation working at the same time as drier, cooler storage. Two separate defenses running together without anyone thinking of it as a system. A lot of today's bread has none of that. No real fermentation time behind it. No preservative doing that job. And a habit of getting sealed warm in conditions that practically hand mold an invitation. That's the loaf so many people are buying without realizing what got left out along the way. It's soft, clean label, bagged while it's still warm, and sitting on shelves everywhere. Some bakeries have found different combinations that close that same gap. Packing a loaf with carbon dioxide and nitrogen instead of ordinary air, cutting off the oxygen mold needs, more than doubled shelf life in one test, even without leaning on fermentation or a classic preservative. Control any one of the three factors well enough, and it can make up for what's missing in the others. So the memory was never nostalgia. It came down to three separate, well-understood pieces of food science, working together in bread that doesn't exist much anymore, and missing just as completely from a lot of the bread that replaced it. None of this means you're stuck watching your bread turn fuzzy by Wednesday. If shelf life matters more than convenience, look for bread with real fermentation, time behind it, sourdough, or a long, slow rise, since that acid is doing real work you can't see. Let a fresh loaf cool completely before you bag it, and store it somewhere cool and dry instead of sealed up warm on a humid counter. And don't assume no preservatives on the label means the bread will keep better, because most of the time it means the opposite. So plan to eat that loaf sooner or freeze half of it. The loaf on your counter is telling you exactly what happened to it. You just need to know what you're looking at if you want more of these. The subscribe button is right there, waiting, and it means the next one finds you without you having to go looking for it.